My fiancé cheated on me with my own brother a couple of months before the wedding and then married him and had a child and then begged me to finance them. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Hannah. At the time, I genuinely believed she was the love of my life. We had been together for nearly 5 years, and I thought we were solid. We were both attorneys, working long hours in a competitive field, but we always made time for each other. The year I proposed to Hannah was supposed to be the start of our perfect future. I had spent months picking out the ring, planning the proposal, and imagining the life we would build together. I was convinced that she was the person I would grow old with. But that same year, everything fell apart. It started when Hannah lost her job. She wasn't laid off, she was fired for misconduct. I won't get into the specifics because it's personal, but let's just say her dismissal wasn't unwarranted. If you've ever known an ambitious, career-driven person, you know how much their job defines them. Losing hers shattered her confidence. She spiraled into stress, anxiety, and frustration. She started sending out dozens of applications, but because her field was highly specialized, and given the circumstances of her firing, opportunities weren't easy to come by. Weeks turned into months, and still, no job. Through it all, I did everything I could to support her. I told her money wasn't an issue, that she didn't need to stress about bills or expenses. We were engaged, after all. I saw it as my responsibility to take care of her during this rough patch. I also encouraged her to take a break and focus on something she loved while job hunting. She had always wanted to try pottery, so I suggested she enroll in a local class. At first, it seemed to help. She had something to keep her occupied, a creative outlet to distract her from the job hunt. But I had no idea that this decision would be the first domino to fall. Because this was where she met Ethan. My younger brother, Ethan, was the complete opposite of me. Where I was the responsible, career-focused one, he was the reckless playboy. The one who never took anything seriously. While I worked hard in school and built a career, Ethan spent his time chasing women, skipping classes, and partying until sunrise. Despite everything, I always had his back. I was his big brother, after all. I helped him financially when he was struggling, bailed him out of more situations than I can count, and even defended him to our parents when they lost hope in him. I had no reason to suspect him. But in hindsight, I was a fool. Ethan was already enrolled in the same pottery class before Hannah joined. I didn't think much of it. In fact, I thought it was good that she had someone she knew there. But then, they started getting closer. At first, it was small things. Ethan offering to drive her to class. Hannah coming home, excitedly telling me stories about their pottery projects. She even started bringing home pieces they made together. Then their interactions expanded beyond pottery. Weekend hangouts. Art gallery visits. Dinners. Activities that Hannah and I used to do together. But now, she was doing them with my brother. I started noticing changes in Hannah's behavior. She was more distant. She would text him constantly, sometimes smiling at her phone in a way that made my gut twist. Then, she started canceling our date nights, to hang out with Ethan. I'm not the type to ignore red flags, so one night, I confronted her. I asked her directly, was something going on between her and my brother? Hannah looked shocked. Offended, even. She denied it immediately. Said they were just friends. She told me that hanging out with Ethan was lighthearted and fun, like spending time with a younger sibling. She even acted hurt that I would question her loyalty. For a moment, I felt guilty. But deep down, something still didn't sit right. I should have trusted my instincts. Because 2 months before our wedding, I walked into my worst nightmare. I had been working long hours to make sure we were financially secure for our wedding. Since Hannah was still unemployed, I was covering everything: rent, bills, wedding expenses. I was exhausted. But I was also excited. I had finished an important work trip early and decided to come home as a surprise. I wanted to take Hannah out for a nice dinner, maybe spend some quality time together. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a car parked outside. Ethan's car. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. But something about it, the time, the situation, felt wrong. It was 9 p.m. Too late for a casual visit. As I walked into the house, I knew something was off. The living room was empty, but the TV was on. The lights were dim. And then I saw them. Scattered beer bottles. And Hannah's clothes on the floor. My stomach dropped. I knew. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. My hands were shaking as I walked toward our bedroom. I pushed the door open. And there they were. Hannah and Ethan. In my bed. They were so lost in each other that they didn't even notice me standing there. For a few seconds, I just stared. I should have walked away. But something inside me snapped. Without a word, I grabbed Ethan by the back of his neck and ripped him off of her. He barely had time to react before I punched him in the face. The crack of his nose breaking was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. He stumbled back, blood gushing down his face, eyes wide with terror. I didn't stop. I hit him again. And again. By the time he hit the floor, begging for mercy, I turned to Hannah. She sat on the bed, shaking, sobbing, her face pale with shock and fear. I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice cold and steady. "You have 10 minutes to get out of my house." She gasped. "What?" "If you're still here after 10 minutes, I said, I won't be responsible for what happens next." She started crying, begging me to listen. I glanced at my watch. 9 minutes left. And that's when she realized, I wasn't bluffing. Hannah scrambled out of bed, shaking, sobbing, trying to grab her clothes with trembling hands. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, as if she expected me to change my mind. "Please, just listen to me," she cried. I didn't flinch. "You've got 9 minutes left." She let out a choked sob, but I could see in her eyes that she finally understood. I wasn't bluffing. I watched her pack, every movement frantic and desperate. She didn't even try to argue anymore. She stuffed whatever she could into her suitcase, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely zip it shut. Ethan, meanwhile, was still on the floor, groaning in pain, one hand clutched over his bleeding nose. I didn't even look at him. He wasn't worth my time. Hannah finally dragged her suitcase down the stairs, stopping at the front door. She turned to face me one last time. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her voice broken. "I still love you," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." I reached forward. For a moment, she thought I was about to pull her into a hug. Instead, I grabbed her left hand, and slid the engagement ring off her finger. "You don't get to say that," I told her, voice void of emotion. She let out another choked sob, but I was already done. I opened the door and shoved her out. She stumbled onto the porch, still crying. I didn't even look back as I slammed the door shut. I stood in my house, fists clenched, breathing heavily. Hannah was gone, but Ethan was still on the floor, wiping blood from his nose. I finally turned to him. His eyes darted up to mine. Pure fear. He knew what was coming next. I took a step forward, and he flinched. "Get up," I growled. He hesitated. I grabbed the collar of his shirt and yanked him to his feet. "I should break your ribs for this," I said, voice deadly quiet. Ethan swallowed hard. "Listen, man, I punched him again. This time, he hit the side of the couch, groaning. I wasn't done. I lunged for him, but then, a loud knock at the door. I froze. Another knock, more urgent. "Open up. It's Mom and Dad." I clenched my jaw. Perfect. I yanked the door open to see my parents standing there, both looking worried and confused. My dad's face immediately darkened when he saw Ethan. "My mom?" She let out a gasp of horror and rushed to Ethan's side. "Oh my God. What happened?" she cried, grabbing his bloodied face. Ethan winced, still wiping his nose. Before he could say anything, I spoke first. I caught him in my bed with Hannah. Silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then, my dad, who had been quietly processing the words, suddenly turned to Ethan. "You did what?" he said, his voice deadly calm. Ethan looked away. "Dad, I..." Crack. My dad's fist hit Ethan's jaw so fast that I barely saw it happen. Ethan stumbled back, clutching his face. "I raised you better than this," Dad said, his voice shaking with rage and disappointment. I let out a bitter laugh. "Apparently not." Ethan staggered back, rubbing his jaw. And then, of course, my mom, always ready to baby him, rushed to his defense. Stop it. He's hurt, she snapped at my dad. I turned to face her. You're seriously defending him? I asked, voice cold. She swallowed hard. No, she hesitated. But he's still your brother, and you shouldn't be fighting like this. I stared at her. He slept with my fiancée. In my bed. Mom flinched at my tone but still held her ground. She turned to Ethan. Say you're sorry, she urged. Tell your brother you regret it. Ethan let out a shaky breath. I do regret it, he mumbled. I'm sorry. I laughed again. It wasn't even funny. I was just so done with this whole thing. But then, Ethan said something that made my blood run cold. I know it's messed up, he muttered. But I love her. Silence. I blinked. My dad stiffened. My mom's face lit up with hope, like this was suddenly a romance story and not the worst betrayal of my life. You what? I asked, my voice eerily calm. Ethan licked his lips nervously. I love Hannah, he said again. And, she loves me. I stepped toward him. He backed up immediately. She told you that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan hesitated. Then, he pulled out his phone. Opened their texts. And handed the screen to me. I scrolled through the messages. Flirty conversations. Secret meetups. Hannah confessing that she wasn't happy with me. That she had feelings for Ethan. And then, the final blow. A message from that night. Hannah, come over. He won't be home yet. I clenched my jaw. So this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was planned. She had invited him over. She thought I'd still be on my work trip. I looked back up at Ethan, my hands shaking with rage. He took a step back, his face pale. Listen, man, I threw his phone against the wall. It shattered on impact. Mom gasped. I turned back to Ethan. If I ever see you again, I said, my voice low and deadly, I'll break more than just your nose. Then, I pointed at the door. Get out. Ethan hesitated. Get out. I roared. He bolted for the door, nearly tripping over himself as he ran out of the house. My mom followed after him, still yelling about how we should all work things out. Only my dad stayed behind. He let out a heavy sigh. I'm sorry, son, he muttered. I wish I had raised him to be a better man. I didn't respond. I just stared at the broken phone on the floor, my entire world shattered alongside it. Ethan was gone. My mother had chased after him, still clinging to whatever ridiculous hope she had of fixing things between us. Only my father stayed behind. I was still standing in the middle of my living room, staring at the shattered pieces of Ethan's phone. Son, my dad finally said, you need to calm down. I let out a bitter laugh. Calm down? I repeated, shaking my head. Dad, I just lost everything in one night. Dad sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. I know, he said. I know this is bad, but I don't want you to do something you'll regret. I looked him dead in the eyes. I already regret ever trusting them. Dad opened his mouth to say something else, but I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear anything. I walked past him, heading toward the stairs. Where are you going? He called after me. I didn't stop. To sleep. That was a lie. I didn't sleep at all that night. The first week was a blur. Hannah had tried to reach out multiple times, texting, calling, even showing up at my house. I ignored her. Eventually, I had the locks changed and told the front office of my apartment complex to never let her in. Ethan? He didn't even bother reaching out. Good. I hoped I never saw his pathetic face again. My mom, however? She wouldn't let it go. She called me over and over, leaving voicemails about how family is forever, and that I needed to forgive Ethan. Forgive him? For what? For betraying me? For sleeping with the woman I was supposed to marry? I blocked her number. Only my dad seemed to respect my space. I think he knew there was nothing he could say to fix this. But just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I got a phone call that changed everything. I was at work when my unknown caller ID flashed across my screen. I almost didn't pick up. But something told me to answer. I put the phone to my ear. And then, I heard the last voice I ever wanted to hear. Ethan. "Hey, man," he said, his tone awkward and hesitant. I almost hung up right then and there. "What do you want?" I snapped. There was a long pause. Then, he dropped the bombshell. "Hannah's pregnant," he said. "And it's mine." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. For a few seconds, I was completely silent. Then, I let out a cold laugh. "Congratulations," I said. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan hesitated. "Well, we're getting married." And I hung up. I sat there for a moment, gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then, I grabbed my coffee cup and threw it across the room. It shattered against the wall. Nobody in the office said a word. I left work early that day. A few weeks later, my worst fears were confirmed. Hannah and Ethan actually went through with it. They got married. And my mom? She was over the moon. She called it God's plan, as if this whole thing was some beautiful love story and not the most disgusting betrayal imaginable. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. Then, I found out they were sending wedding invitations to our extended family. One of my cousins texted me. "Hey man, I just got an invite to Ethan and Hannah's wedding, are you okay?" I was furious. Furious that they had the audacity to act like this was normal. Like I was just supposed to accept it. Like it wasn't the most humiliating thing in the world for me. I didn't respond to the message. I just deleted it. And that was the moment I knew. I was done with my family. Forever. When my mom called me again, I finally picked up. Before she could speak, I cut her off. "I want nothing to do with you," I said. She gasped. "Honey, please. Lose my number," I continued, my voice cold. "Forget I exist." "Honey, you don't mean that," she tried again. "Ethan is still your brother." "Not anymore." Silence. Then, my mom started crying. I didn't care. I hung up and blocked her number. Then, I blocked Ethan. Blocked Hannah. Blocked everyone who had chosen to side with them. Even my dad. Because no matter how neutral he claimed to be, he still stood by them. I left the city 2 weeks later. Packed up everything and started fresh in a new place. And for 3 years, I lived in peace. Until Hannah showed up at my door. For 3 years, I lived in peace. I had a new job. A new home. New friends. I never gave my number or address to anyone from my old life, except for my dad. And even then, we only spoke on rare occasions. No one knew where I was. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Until yesterday. I was in the middle of making dinner when I heard the knock. It was late. Too late for a random visitor. I frowned. No one ever came to my place unannounced. I walked to the door and opened it. And there she was. Hannah. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. I hadn't seen her face in 3 years. But she looked different. Gone was the confident, put-together woman I had once known. Her hair was thin and lifeless, her clothes shabby, and her face gaunt, like she hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. And beside her? A little girl, no older than 2 or 3, clutching her hand. I didn't need to ask. The resemblance was unmistakable. She had Ethan's features. She was his daughter. Hannah's lip trembled. "Please," she whispered. "Can we talk?" I stared at her, my mind racing. Every instinct in my body told me to slam the door in her face. But then, I looked down at the child. She was staring up at me with innocent, wide eyes. I sighed. Fine. I stepped aside, letting them in. But I already knew, this wasn't going to end well. I led them to the couch and sat across from them. "Talk," I said. Hannah hesitated. Then, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to me without a word. I opened it. The moment I saw the handwriting, my stomach twisted. My mother. I started reading. And with every word, my anger grew. She had written that since Ethan was gone, it was now my responsibility to step up. That I needed to take care of Hannah and the child, because I was still family. I almost laughed out loud. I looked up at Hannah, my jaw clenched. What is this supposed to mean? She broke down. Through tears, she finally told me everything. Ethan had been cheating on her for years. Even after she gave birth, he kept having affairs, making excuse after excuse. And then, 3 months ago, he packed his bags and disappeared. No note. No warning. Just gone. Since then, Hannah had been struggling to survive. She had no job, no money, and no home. For a while, my mom had been secretly sending her money. But now? My mom had decided she was done. So now, Hannah had nowhere to go. And that's why she was here. She thought I would help her. I let out a slow breath, setting the letter down. Then, I looked her dead in the eyes. No. Hannah's breath hitched. What? She whispered. I leaned forward. You are not my responsibility, I said coldly. She let out a choked sob. I know, but, she glanced at her daughter, her voice shaking. Please, she's just a child. She doesn't deserve this. I looked at the little girl again. She didn't. She was innocent. But I refused to let Hannah manipulate me. I stood up. You need to leave. She started crying harder. I spent my last few dollars on gas to come here, she sobbed. I have nowhere else to go. I clenched my jaw. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything. How she had betrayed me. How she had chosen Ethan over me. How she had destroyed my life. I took a deep breath. Then, I walked to my wallet, pulled out a few $100s, and held it out to her. This is the last thing I'll ever do for you. She hesitated, staring at the money. Then, with shaking hands, she took it. She looked back up at me, her eyes filled with pain. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't respond. I just walked to the door and held it open. She understood. She stood up, took her daughter's hand, and walked out. I didn't watch them leave. I just closed the door. And locked it. For good. After that, I knew what I had to do. I called my dad. He picked up on the second ring. Son. I got straight to the point. Why did you give Hannah my address? Silence. Then, a deep sigh. Your mother begged me, he admitted. She thought that if you saw her, you'd want to help. I clenched my jaw. So you just gave her my location? Dad sighed again. We were desperate. Ethan's been gone for months. We didn't know what else to do. I let out a cold laugh. So you didn't know what to do, so you threw it on me? I'm sorry, he said. I really am. I wasn't interested in apologies. I took a deep breath and made my final decision. You need to lose my number, I said. For good. Dad went silent. Son. You made your choice, I cut him off. Now I'm making mine. And I hung up. Then, I blocked his number. And my mom's. And anyone else connected to them. I was done. For real this time. Thank you for watching the video, like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.